Welcome, everybody. This is Shorebird ID Segment 1, Great Lakes Edition. We're going to be covering the groups Calidris and Tringa, some of the more common identification challenges of shorebirds in our region. I wanted to do this for a few years, and I've been putting together images and taking notes and reading and researching and doing everything I can to figure out a couple ways to separate some of these really similar shorebirds. I know it's a bit of a challenge for some people to go, because you have a lot of birds that are very similar in appearance, shape. Sometimes they'll forage together in groups, and they can be a little bit tough to separate and a little bit daunting. So one of the reasons for that, I think, is because they're not something that you're going to come across at your feeder. You have to go to a specific habitat to find these guys. We have, mixed success with finding habitat, depending on water levels, how much rain, how dry the summer has been, or spring. And they're not always going to be there. They can be plentiful one year in one spot and then completely absent the next. There's not a lot of diagnostic field marks that that you can look to and completely distinguish them. So there's not a lot of diagnostic field marks that when you look at one thing, you're going to be able to know, okay, this is that species. The plumage is the main culprit. We're used to looking at wing bars, certain color patterns, streaking, and the like for passerines and hawks and things there like that. But you don't necessarily have a reliable plumage for most of these shorebirds. The difference can be nominal between adults, juveniles, birds of different species can all look very, very similar. And if you focus on plumage, you can get lost real quick. So there's a handful of them that are going to be virtually identical until you spend some time with them in the field. And that's what I'm going to try to give you a couple tips here to how to sort those guys out. So to get started with them, the number one thing you can do is just get out there and spend some time with them. Watch them forage. Get out to spots where you know you're going to see them. Take some pictures if you can. Look at images online, compare them, and you'll start to see these subtleties jump out at you. It's one of the great things about shorebirds is that there's always little mysteries there to be discovered. I think personally, when I see a group of birds that's out in the open, I get a good look at them, but I don't instantly know what that species is. It's really, really kind of novel to me, and it's fun because every once in a while you see something that you didn't expect, or maybe others have overlooked, and it's a thrill. It's a lot of fun, and they're in a lot of cases very approachable if you play your cards right, and you keep the movements to a minimum, and you lay in a path that they're going to forage towards. One of my favorite things is just to lay in the sand and let them come to me on a beach, and they'll come within 5-6 feet of you at times, and you sort of enter into their world in a way that you can't with a lot of these songbirds that are perched up at the top of the trees, foraging in a canopy or above your head or just flying over. You don't really have that physical connection to them. These guys are on the ground. They're looking right at you. You can hear the little call notes and see the behaviors and the little nuances that you might not be able to get through, binoculars. It's just a little bit different experience if you can see these guys up close, and it's won me over. They're one of my favorite groups of birds, and yeah, I hope this will help you enjoy them as well. So you want to group these guys into comparisons species. So the way I'm going to have it set up here is peeps, which are the small Calidris sandpipers that are about the size of a sparrow, a little bit bigger. Tringa genus, which are the yellow legs and similar. And then outside of that, you would call those the oddballs, large sandpipers, etc. And then once we get into the second section, there's some really cool ones there, the phalaropes and dowitchers, plovers, and birds like that. So I would suggest that the main thing that you should focus on is shape. Don't worry about the plumage right away. Look at the bill shape, look at the head shape, look at the proportions. These are all ways that you can separate these birds. Add a few of them together. You might say, okay, the bill looks a certain way, The wings are a certain length, legs are a certain length, and then you can start looking at some of the plumage details. And then once you gather a few of those clues, you can put together an ID. And the other thing that I put together sort of last minute when I was thinking about this is pay attention to the temperature. If they're cold, the body shape changes. They puff up, they look more rounded. And when it's warm, they're going to streamline and they're going to look, their necks will be extended. They're not going to be puffed out. So the whole shape of the bird is going to change. So keep that in mind. If you're out there, say, a week ago and you're looking at a Dunlin, it's going to look a lot different than the same Dunlin in middle of May on a balmy 80-degree day at the beach. They're going to look completely different, even though everything else checks out. So here's a way of assessing a shorebird. You want to put together some details. So in this case, we have a small peep that's foraging in a shallow parking lot puddle mid-September. It's got kind of a proportionately large head. It's got warm tones. It's got short legs, but specifically on this one, you want to look at the strong cap to the head that's frequent on this bird. There is a short droop at the terminal quadrant that comes to a fine point, and the legs are greenish yellow. Those are all very, very useful ID clues for a least sandpiper. There's not a lot of sandpipers that are going to have the greenish yellow legs, but sometimes, depending on how they forage, they could be in muddy water that'll obscure that. So if you see green legs, it's a good chance. If it's small, it's going to be a least sandpiper. But if it has gray legs, it doesn't necessarily rule out least sandpiper. It might be something that's been in muddy water or water that's been creating a coating on the legs it's hard to see, or you have a lying photograph. That always happens too. If you process the color and it drops out the green, or your camera doesn't interpret the green, you can sort of lose that. So don't always rule it out just on the green. It's not the only thing to look at on this bird. The bill to me is the one, and the kind of the appearance of the head. That is the more important thing to look for a least sandpiper. So we'll get into some places you can find them. Mud flats, beaches, flooded farm fields, sod farms, ponds, breakwalls. Depending on the type of bird, they can be found in these habitats. Some not at all. Plovers are one that's not necessarily going to be right by water. You can find some of the large plovers, Barred sandpiper, and buff-breasted at sod farms. They might not be tied to a water feature. In the same way, you might not find a sanderling at a mud flat. They like bigger open beaches with large bodies of water. Your typical semi-palmated and least will be frequently on mud flats, and a lot of them you'll find there as well. Certain birds, depending on the leg length, will be able to exploit different depths of water. So, keeping the habitat in mind can help you to sort through the sandpipers as well. Some of the best places to go, in my opinion, are Howard Marsh and Point Mouillet. They both provide good habitat if the water levels are right for a number of shorebirds. Howard, to me, is the crown jewel that we got going on right now as far as shorebirds. It seems like it has pretty reliable habitat for birds. In the few years that it's been open, it's a little bit more manageable than Point Mouillet. If you've not been there, you got to ride a bike out several miles to get to the cells that are drawn down low enough for shorebirds at a lot of cases. Or you might have a year like we had last summer where there just isn't any shorebird habitat to speak of. Had a lot of rain and the water levels were too high. So you're not going to get a bird with short little legs. It's not going to be able to forage in 2-3 feet of water. Lake St. Clair Metro Park is one that a lot of these photos are going to be coming from, depending on the conditions and the habitat available. You can get a number of them cruising the beach there. It's a place that I like to just sort of lay low and let the birds come to me, and it's great for photography. Maumee Bay is a place that we led a field trip to in September, the big day. I know a number of you probably joined us for that. And we had real good luck with sanderlings and ruddy turnstones. And the next week I went and had great looks at semi-palmated and least. So you can see some really, really cool things there. Tawas Point, I take my family there to the beach all the time, and we're frequently later in the summer surrounded by sanderlings and semi-palmated plovers. Muskegon wastewater can be an absolute magnet for rarities. Last year we had a sharp-tailed sandpiper that showed up And I think there's only been like 3 reports of it in Michigan, and 2 of them, I believe, 2 or 3 of them are at Muskegon wastewater. So there's some good stuff you can get there. That's where the rarities are, but you might have to put up with some unpleasant smells and having to get your permits and everything out there, and it's a bit of a drive for us, but it can often pay dividends, and you can get a lot of great birds there. So here's how we're going to group it up. The genus Calidris is the peeps. Genus Tringa is the yellow legs. And those are the 2 that we're going to focus on in this presentation. For next week's presentation, we're going to cover plovers, dowitchers, godwits, and phalaropes, and some of the more impressive, unique-looking shorebirds that didn't quite fit into the groups that we're covering today. But the ones we're going to talk about today are the typical birds that we're going to come across in Michigan and Ohio and around the Great Lakes region. So let's get started with one of the more common birds is the semi-palmated sandpiper. It's small for starters. It's got a very short, thick bill that's very straight. Has a little bit of a bulbous tip to the end. It's a hair bigger than a least sandpiper, but if you don't have them side by side, it's probably not anything that you're going to be able to use for identification. The legs are short and they're black and gray. Behaviorally, they are often chasing each other all over the mud flat, fighting and flapping and just causing a ruckus. So if you see a small group of peeps that are fighting constantly, that could give you your first clue that you're looking at semi-palmated. The colors compared to a least are often a little bit less rich and warm, but it's definitely not something that I'd say is diagnostic. So when we're looking at the least sandpiper, the head to me is something that is very, very distinctive to this bird. Once you get a couple hours of sorting through these guys, you'll see that they have that drooping tip to the bill with a fine point, and often a bit of a reddish brown cap and some warm tones on the back. Not something, again, like it's not always absent in the semi-palmated, which is your usual direct comparison species, but if you add enough of these things together, you certainly will be on the right track for identifying least sandpiper. They're slightly smaller, but again, it's not something, unless you're having side by side, that you're probably gonna be able to tell. And the legs are greenish and yellow. Again, if you see the greenish yellow legs, you probably have a least sandpiper. But in this case, if you look at this photo, they're a little bit more gray because it was foraging in some, murky water that covered the legs in this particular photo. So side by side, here's the 2 birds. You can see that the semi-palmated has a straighter bill, a little bit taller head, but it's hard to really assess that consistently. But once you look at the face, the least sandpipers jump out at you a little bit more than the semi-palmated, and the colors are a little bit usually warmer in the least sandpiper. Another one that you'll come across is the sanderling. This is one that is on beaches more often than not. The behavior on these guys is very frenetic. They're little spazzes. They're running up and down the beach. They're chasing waves. They usually travel in small groups, and they bob their head when they scurry on the beach. Their first impression of this bird is that it's a black and white sandpiper with a lot of white on it. So when you see maybe 3 birds land at your feet when you're out at the beach with your family, and your first impression is, okay, that's a white bird with some black on it, the sanderling should be your first choice. They're a little bit bigger than the 2 we just discussed, at least in semi-palmated. They lack a hind toe, and they have a longer bill that's also straight. So if you were to take the semi-palmated and just extend it out maybe 20% longer, that's basically what the sanderling bill looks like. And if you get a real good look, you can see that their nostril has a figure 8 shape to it, and it's a little bit longer than either of the other two. It's one of my favorite little field marks. If you get a good photo that you can really point you in the right direction for sanderling. But this is one that's fairly tricky. I took this one in September, Maumee Beach, or Maumee Bay State Park Beach. And I took this one in the springtime, and see the difference in the plumage on this bird. It's got a lot more rusty tones. It's got a lot more streaking on the head. The bill shape is the same. The structural is the same. It's got a small head compared to the body. Wing length doesn't change. But if you were relying on plumage for this bird, that's a different bird, and it can throw you for a loop. If you're looking for all this type of pattern here, and you see one end of September, okay, you might have a handle on it, and then you see it the next year and it doesn't look anything like it. So that's why it's important to pay attention to the proportions of the bill and the head shape and the leg length and all those characteristics. So the outlier in this group is the Western sandpiper. When you're sorting through peeps and you see one that has a longer bill, you might have a Western. They're rare in Michigan, but we do get them pretty much every year, usually mixed in with a flock of other peeps. So if you see something that strikes you as maybe a semi-palmated, but the bill is much longer and it has a slight bit of a droop at the tip, but everything else checks out, black legs, not a leaf sandpiper, doesn't really have much patterning on the back here, you could have a Western. I wouldn't ever default to this bird. It's going to be something that if you just you don't feel confident calling it a semi-palmated, look at that bill length. And the other thing that you can look at from a behavioral standpoint is that the legs on the Western sandpiper are longer. Let's see. You talking about the dark in the shoulder for sanderling? I don't think so. I think this one's still transitioning here from non-breeding plumage. So eventually, I think this pattern here you see on the back would extend all the way onto the wings. This one is still on his way up north to the breeding territory, and I don't think it's complete in the plumage yet. So this guy, back to the Western, if you see a little bit longer billed sandpiper that's kind of in deeper water than say the group of least or semi-palmated, then that can be a clue that it's a Western. But I wouldn't trick yourself into thinking that everything is going to be a Western, because it's still fairly rare in the region. So I have a lineup here that you can compare how the bill length and the head shape reflect on each other. These are according to size. At least is the smallest, sanderling is the biggest from this group. And if you look, we got sort of a long straight bill on the sanderling, got the elongated nostril. Western sandpiper also has a long bill, but it's proportionally longer when you compare it to the head length than the sanderling. And it kind of has a slight bit of a droop and a taper here. This one, not so much compared to the one we had in the previous slide, but it is there. Semi-palmated is sort of average bill. It doesn't really have anything particularly notable about it. It's very straight, thick base to it. It's got a little bit of a bulbous tip. This one's the most distinctive, in my opinion, the least downward droop and a fine tip to it. And if you look at the shape of the head, you can see like the position of the eye. It's a little bit different in all this. Like this one's set a little further back. It's a little bit squintier looking than the semi-palmated. They have just a slight bit of a different look to them. And once you spend a few hours obsessing over shorebirds, you can really you can start seeing those subtle differences. But it does take a little time before they start becoming obvious to you. So we have our first little quiz here. These are the body shapes of the 4 that we discussed. So what does everybody think that first one is? What species would you say that is? We got the kind of smaller head proportion to the body, straight bill, and it's kind of average in size. What would you say? Any guesses on that one?
Semi-palm.
Wait, was that you, Diane?
Yeah, it was.
Didn't you see this already?
You know what? It takes so long for this stuff to sink in. I'm so bad at shorebirds. It's going to sink in one day, Joe. So I'm back again. Yeah.
No cheating, though. All right, but Diane is correct. That is a semi-palmated. All right. Anything?
I won't answer anymore.
No, you can. I'm giving a hard time. So what's your impression on this one? What does everybody think this guy is?
Western.
Is indeed a Western.
Look at that long ass bill.
Yeah, got a long bill. So if you look at, oh, Gina has a good question. What does palmated mean? That means it has a slight bit of webbing between the toes. So if you ever were to get close enough to a semi-palmated sandpiper or a semi-palmated plover, you'd see a little bit of webbing at the base of the toes. But I have never gotten close enough or had a decent enough angle to even be able to recognize that in the field, and only barely in photographs. So, you know, it kind of something that gets swept under the rug because it's just so hard to ever see that when you're with shorebirds. They're usually in water or their feet are behind gravel or, you know, in the sand or something, and it's really hard to see. So if you look at bird C, you had a big head proportionate to the body and a drooping bill with a fine tip. What does everybody think that one is?
Please.
Yeah, for sure.
Please.
Piper, and that leaves the big guy as the sanderling. So looking at this lineup here, we got biggest of the group is the sanderling. It's quite a bit bigger, so if it's standing next to either of these three, it's going to tower over them a little bit. But the bill is a little bit longer than semi-palm, but it's got the same qualities. It's very straight. Western is going to have a kind of a big schnoz on him, and the leaf sandpiper has that downward drooping fine tip bill with a bigger head proportionate to the body. All right, so we're going to get into the early arriving birds. These should be starting to pop up in the region right about now. Pectoral sandpiper. It's quite a bit larger than the three that we discussed, except for maybe the sanderling. A lot of people think it reminds them of a large leaf sandpiper. You have the yellowish green legs. You get the bill that droops at the tip. And the overall warm tones. So the thing that stands out to me on these guys is they do have oftentimes an orange base to the bill. But the thing that I would always look to first is look at how sharply the contrast is from the streaking on the breast to that white belly. You don't get that in a lot of other sandpipers. It's more of a slight transition, but here it's a very sharp edge. And these guys are not always found right at the water's edge. They're gonna sometimes be out in grasslands, which is their nesting habitat, so they feel comfortable there. They're not terribly approachable, in my opinion. So it's hard to get good looks at them sometimes. And the one thing I would note about this photo is you see how that shape of that body is almost like an egg with a beak sticking out of it. I took this, it was about 38 degrees and my hands were numb. And this bird is very cold. It was that Muskegon wastewater plant. I was chasing a rough sandpiper. It's an Asian vagrant. And these guys were in the same cell with it, much closer. And I photographed them, and I thought it'd be a good way to show you how the shape changes. So here's this bird when it's cold. Here's this bird when it's warm. See how that bird now, its posture is a little bit more elongated. It's standing up and it's proud and it's got a longer neck. The body is a little slimmer looking, but some of those field marks are still there. The legs are the same color. The bill still has that droop to it. It still has the orange on the base of the bill, gradiating out to some black. It's got the streaking and the sharp contrast here from the buffy breast with the streaking above and the white belly. So this is the thing where the shape can really get you. If you're looking at a bird that is cold and then you see one that's warm, it doesn't necessarily look like the same bird if you're paying attention to shape, which is a bit of a pitfall. So keep that in mind. It's a subtle thing, but it can really throw you for a loop if you're not mindful of what temperature you're at. Here's another one that comes through fairly early. It's the Dunlin. It's a pretty distinctive looking sandpiper. It's got a very long bill, long droop to it. When they're in breeding plumage, they have a very distinct black belly patch and a really attractive chestnut color on the back with some black streaking. And they're overall pretty stout. They almost remind me of the cross between a sandpiper and maybe like a snipe, just in the way the head is proportionate to the body and bill length and so forth. They're also very social. You'll see groups of, 5 to 100 around particularly in some of the marshes around the Lake Erie region. This one was taken at Howard Marsh, where it was in a small group, but then in other parts of the park there were hundreds of them, and they just seem to be everywhere at that time. So they're very social. They are approximately the same size in mass as the pectoral, but they are a little bit more compact. So they're going to be larger than your sanderlings and semi-palmated, but in the realm of the pectoral. So here's another one that can really throw a curveball at you. This is the summer breeding plumage, and here is one in the fall. These guys come through pretty late in the fall, so as you can imagine, it's going to be colder, which means you're going to get that puffed up look. And none of those markings are present on this bird. I didn't take this photo. I should have mentioned that. This one and the pectoral that was stretched out, those are both photos I had to pull to give you the comparison of the shape. This guy is very cold tolerant. I know a lot of them overwinter on the East Coast, like New Jersey. They'll often be with purple sandpipers and ruddy turnstones, and they're not averse to being in those cold temperatures. They're just looking for open water and feeding opportunities. The other thing is when they're cold, they're either feeding or they're staying warm. So they might have their head tucked under their wing, and that makes it kind of a nightmare, but you can still have a reasonable idea that these guys are sort of indistinct, but they're very round. That bill's very long. That doesn't change. Leg color is the same. And when you get into November, there's not a lot of the shorebirds still hanging out, but you can get these guys and some others, the white rumps, and I think some of the vagrants will come through. I think the famous spotted redshank was late in the season as well. So here are the two bookend sandpipers. This one comes late in the migration, and one comes a little earlier. This is the earlier of the two, the Baird sandpiper. The other is the white rump sandpiper, and I know there's like a yin and yang feel to these two, and I'll explain to you when you see the other slide. This one is most notable, has long wings. It has primaries that extend past the tail tip. It's hard to see exactly where the tip of the tail is in here, but when you look at this bird in silhouette, you see a bird that has longer wings than virtually any comparable sandpiper that you're going to come across. It has some of the warm tones that are usually present when you see these guys on migration. They remind me a bit of what a Lincoln sparrow is to a song sparrow, so that being that there's a buffy color that's a background to these streaks, and this kind of pleasing scalloping look to the feathers. They have a steep forehead, which is notable in this one. I don't know if you guys can see that. And the bill is very fine and has a slight droop to it, downward curve. And they usually they're not real common. You only get a few chances a year to see these guys, and it's usually early in migration. So maybe third week of August, somewhere in there, these guys will show up, and they're not always found by a water feature. You can see them out in sod farms or up on a field somewhere where you wouldn't necessarily expect to see a sandpiper. You know, I say that this one was on a beach when I took this photo, but I can't tell you how many semi-palmated and leaf sandpipers I photograph trying to turn them into this bird. And once you see them and you spend some time with them, they don't really look that similar. The profile is a lot different. They have sort of this little hump on their back too that you don't see on some of the other ones. That's just the way their posture is. But they're a little bit bigger than the semi-palmated and the leaf sandpiper as well. But that wing length, that's the thing that I would like you to really focus on here. They have black legs as well, but the overall elongated wing and body size and proportions are important for identifying this one. And then you can get into, well, it's got warm, rich tones, and it's got that buffy look to it. And it's got the slightly steep forehead, got the long bill that kind of comes to a fine point, and it's not very thick at the base. Now, the opposite of that in this case is the white rump sandpiper. It has longer wings, but they're not as proportionately long. They don't really strike out. They don't strike a chord with you the same way that Baird's does. This one comes later in migration, so it's going to have a little bit more of that puffed up look generally when you see them. The one description for this bird's proportions is that it sort of is more muscular looking, like it has some muscles under the feathers, that has a thicker, stouter build to it than the Baird's. But it does, it comes usually later in the season, so October. This one I was photographing this one, I think in November at Lake Sinclair Metro Park. The name, as the name suggests, it does have a white patch on the rump. I selected this photo because you can actually see it. Usually you can only see it when they're flying. This one hadn't settled down his feathers all the way, and it revealed that white patch. They overall have a more cooler look to the feathers, but you can see there's some lighter, warmer tones on the edge of the feathers here, so that's indicative of what their breeding plumage would look like. So don't necessarily say it's a white rump when you have the cool plumage. The bill is relatively average. It's a little bit longer than most, but it doesn't have anything that really strikes out. It stands out to you. But there's one little field mark that I can't find any references to in any of my research, but at the base of the mandible here, there's this rosy, lighter coloration here. And I've seen it on every photo I've encountered of the species. It's sometimes more dramatic than this. This is probably the most subtle that I've ever seen it, but it's there. If you get a decent look at it, there's always this lighter patch right here at the base. And if you see that on a bird that might not have anything else that stands out to you, you can pretty much be assured that it's a white rump sandpiper. And this is a bird that when it comes in, it's sort of unexpected, and you don't really know how to categorize it. It's not overly showy in any way, but it has a lot of average qualities, and when you add it up and then you see that lighter base to the bill, you can confidently say it's a white rump sandpiper. But again, this is not one that is frequently encountered. I think it flies under the radar with a lot of birders, but they do show up every year, and you can get out there and see them if you play your cards right. Now, the big guy in this group is the red knot. It's quite a bit larger than any of the other Calidris sandpipers that we've discussed. It has a horizontal body posture even when it's resting and not foraging, so the back is not going to have an upward angle to it when it's standing still. The bill got a very thick base to it. It's fairly long. Got a decent enough fine point to it, but it's not anything that is particularly remarkable. The legs in this plumage are green as well, but it's the size that would really stand out to you with this bird. In non-breeding plumage, as this one is, it has a very clean look to it. You have gray feathers edged in white. It almost, when you see them at a distance, they look like a gull. If you can see the black tail tip with the gray wings and sort of the overall light whitish color here, it's big enough, and the patterns are consistent when you see them at a distance, where it looks less like a shorebird than any of the others. It looks more like it's approaching like a Bonaparte's gull or something like that. And this one is had a pretty drastic population decline as the horseshoe crab populations and eggs are being exploited for various research and food. I can't remember. He's something with the horseshoe crabs that they take them for research and they use the blood for something. But these guys show up in big numbers to feed on the horseshoe crab eggs on the East Coast, and they time their migration to coincide with it. I think the full moon in May, they'll show up in the Delaware Bay in New Jersey in some thousands, and you can see them. But they won't look like this when you see them. They'll look more like that. They have a really rich cinnamon color to them that is distinctive, and it's a showstopper. It's got a really nice look to this bird when you see them in breeding plumage. In flight, it has long pointed wings, probably longer than you'd think based on how bulky this bird is. And when you see them, they're just a beautiful bird. That richness to them, it's very, very striking. This is another photo I didn't take, but I'm having a lot of good looks at the breeding plumage of the species. We do get them, but they're usually one-offs. I think they show up a little bit more frequently on the western part of the state along Lake Michigan, but we do get them. Maumee Bay State Park, I think, usually has at least 1 or 2 sightings a year, but again, they would be in non-breeding plumage, so you wouldn't get the chance to see them in this plumage. But they're a large sandpiper. The bill is straight, long, and they'll tower over some of the other birds in this group. So here is the body shape review for this group. Anybody have a guess on what we have for A? Or what stands out to you about this silhouette here?
Horizontal?
Oh, the long
wings.
Yeah, you look at this one, it's got long wings. It's got kind of a long, thin bill that slightly tapers downward. What would you say that one is? Any guesses?
They're
I hear Baird's? Yes, indeed. That is a Baird's sandpiper.
Yep.
So when you see it, got a very elongated look to it compared to the other birds in this group. All right, how about B? Got kind of a stout-looking bird, long bill that droops downward.
Dunlin.
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 Yep, it's got kind of a big head. It's got a long bill that noticeably droops.
No, they can't hear me.
All right, for C, you got a bird with slightly long wings that's got a muscular-looking body, a straight bill, and it's kind of average in its proportions. What would you say this bird is?
White rump?
Correct. Yeah. White rump sandpiper. Very good. So if you can tell out of this group, it's not particularly distinctive in its silhouette, and that'll give you, but it does have a longer wings than most. All right, big guy, what would you say this one is?
Red knot.
Red knot, yes. All right. The pectoral is the last one. All right, so looking at these, you're either going to see that they're all exactly the same, or you're going to start seeing that there's some subtle differences that you can really key in on when you get some experience. So whichever of those two groups you fall into is completely fine. I wouldn't ever beat yourself up if you see them and you're like, well, that's all the same picture. That's completely fine. It would just indicate that you might want to get out there and just spend a little bit more time with them. But there are subtle differences in shape and size in proportions to these guys. So these are the Calidris sandpipers that we're going to cover today. And now we're going to move on to the Tringas. So the Tringa that we're gonna come across most frequently in the Great Lakes region is the lesser yellowlegs. The two of them obviously are the greater and lesser yellowlegs. The default one on any given day is usually the lesser yellowlegs, and you kind of work off of that one. Certain parts of the country or certain times of the year, you might have more greater yellowlegs, but I usually, apply it the same way that's like a red-tailed hawk or a song sparrow. How is it not a lesser yellowlegs? You're probably going to only have these two species to compare, so it makes it a little bit easier. And the big thing with these is the bill length. So a lesser yellowlegs, if you take the bill from here to here, it's going to be approximately the same length as from here to here on the head. If it's longer than that, you can assume it's a greater. So a lot of people say if you were to take this bill and jam it through the head, does the tip of the bill stick way out through the back of the head or no? So in this case, it's approximately the same length. It might be a little touch longer, or at least maybe just in the angle. The base of the yellow legs is a little bit smaller here than you'll see on the next slide. It kind of flares out to the leg joint, and in flight they give a flight call of 2 notes, and the greater yellow legs gives flight calls in 3 or 4 notes. So if it flies, you got a group of them flying over, and you hear, that's a lesser. You hear, that is a greater. The greater has a little bit more resonance to it from being that it's a larger bird, but these guys, when you hear them, 2 notes, lesser. So that's really helpful. This guy, I would ignore the plumage altogether. This one has a lot of streaking on it because it is in breeding plumage. But the differences in the plumages is probably greater in the same species than it is in between the different species. So it's completely unreliable unless you are just your attention to detail is beyond anything that the world has ever known, in which case, good for you. So here is the greater yellow legs. This bird has a particularly long bill, so it's dramatically longer than the length of the head. It has a bit of an upward tilt to it. So if you look at the bill, starts angling upward right in the mid-length here. It's not that won't always seal the deal for you, but is very helpful when you're kind of comparing them. It's a lot bigger than the lesser yellow legs, but when you don't have them standing side by side or anything to reference for size, it can really be difficult. Anecdotally, some people say that it's easier to see the nostril on the greater yellow legs, so the base of the bill is a lighter color. It's not reliable. This bird could have jammed his beak in the mud and it's all black throughout. You never know. Obviously, we discussed in the last slide, 3 to 4 call notes in a group. And the base of the leg is more like a plank of wood. It's straight. It doesn't taper out as much. It's pretty much the same width down at the leg joint as it is right where it meets the body. So these guys are quite a bit larger when you see them side by side. So if they're in a group with both species, you should be able to tell just based on how much larger the greater yellow legs is than the lesser. You can see here, it's a darker gray base of the bill. This is lighter gray with almost like a yellowish color here. These guys will forage in deeper water than the peeps. So a lot of times you won't see them together necessarily unless they're on a mud flat. And the one thing to keep in mind with the yellow legs is they can swim. So usually that's something you associate with the groups called the phalaropes, which spin around like tops, and they're sometimes out, far out at sea. They're more of an aquatic bird than a lot of the shorebirds are, but these guys, when they're swimming, they can give you that idea that maybe you might have a phalarope in the end. So just keep that in mind as you get out. There's some different behavior with these guys, but they're common. They show up, almost at the same time as every other shorebird. So they're there late, they're there early. They'll be mixed into almost every group that you come across as shorebirds. They're very common, and they're fun, but they're skittish and they're sometimes hard to approach too. So you're probably not going to have this one, you know, picking at your sandals when you're on the beach. They're generally a mud flat or shallow water specialist instead of open beaches. Now here's one that can kind of throw you for a loop. It's the solitary sandpiper. It's got a more compact shape than either of the yellow legs. It's got more greenish legs, but again, depending on what kind of water it's been in, you know, you can have that color get onto a greater or lesser yellow legs, or if they're foraging up to their belly, you don't see that at all. That can be a problem for you. They don't tend to have as much streaking and spotting on the back. It's more of a flat brown with some flecks of white. The one thing that is noticeable on this bird is that it has a white eye ring, and the bill is a little bit thinner, and it comes to a finer point, and it droops downward. The other two don't really have that. It also is a little bit of a habitat specialist. It prefers ponds, freshwater ponds. It will breed in our area here, and it'll sometimes come out of nowhere. You'll be at a park or something, and you'll come across some random sandpiper where you weren't expecting it, and this is a good culprit here. You'll see these in midsummer sometimes, but they're more what I would consider the average sandpiper in this genus. So they're not real tall, they're not real long, they have a real long neck, they don't have a real long bill, they're just sort of average. But that eye ring, leg color, plumage, and habitat can kind of help you sort this bird out from the lesser yellow legs, which would probably be the only one that you're likely to confuse it for, depending on what kind of look you get. But the thing with these guys is they tend to forage in ponds and areas with great cover, and not so much out in the open. The yellow legs are usually kind of out there a little ways, and the solitary tends to hug areas with some dense cover. I don't know if it's a security thing for them or if it's just the habitat they're used to, but they don't generally mix too frequently with the yellow legs as far as foraging side by side, but you do see it occasionally. The other one that's the honorary Tringa is the spotted sandpiper. It's the same kind of average shape as the solitary. This is a non-breeding bird here, so it has sort of a indistinct look to it. Clean white belly, clean gray back. It has a noticeable eye ring here. But the two things for this bird, bill's a little bit thicker based and blunt than the solitary. But there's two things that really kind of give this species away, especially if you see them live. Like, I'm not going to be able to tell one of them from the photo, but they bob their tail constantly. The solitary will do it occasionally, but the spotted sandpiper bobs all the time. It's like part of their DNA. It's obsessive the way that it bobs its tail. So if you see a bird bobbing its tail with every breath it takes, probably a spotted sandpiper. The other little thing here to look at is there's a white shoulder patch here. It's a white comma, as Jamie would say, that comes up or kind of curls around the wing here. That's present in the breeding and non-breeding plumage of this bird. So you'll see that one on almost every bird, unless there's something really off with its plumage. But it's a spotted sandpiper. Where are all the spots? Well, in breeding plumage, the whole thing's covered in spots and streaks everywhere. It has a white supercilium and an eye line. The bill becomes a bright orange, and it's a very, very interesting looking bird that'll show up throughout the the summer. You'll see them beaches in Lake Michigan, ponds in Kensington. You'll see them all over the place. Sometimes places you wouldn't necessarily expect to see them, they'll show up. But in the summer, they have the spot, a lot of the spotting, that's their namesake. But look for the eye line, the supercilium, body shape. That's all, going to be present in every bird. And then you can see right here, it's not the best angle for it, but that white comma there is still present. It's just got spots on it now. Now, the big guy in this group is the willet. It isn't real common in our region. It's got the same overall shape as a yellow legs, but it's heavier set. It's got a thick bill. It's got thicker body. The legs are a little bit thicker at the top, at the base than the yellow legs. They don't have that bright color that the yellow legs though, so that should be your first clue. Your first impression of this bird is just going to be bleh, but when it opens its wings, you see this beautiful black and white high contrast pattern that it really transforms this bird. This one right here has a lot of streaking and breeding plumage, but when it's in non-breeding plumage, it's just flat gray. There's nothing distinctive about the plumage at all. So that's something to keep in mind. Just the plumage on this one. When you see a large shorebird that has a big, thick bill that's fairly long, but it doesn't look like much. The willet is present on both coasts. It shows up in the Lake Erie region. I think sometimes they'll get them out at like Whitefish Point and along Lake Michigan as well. But I've most frequently encountered these guys kind of around the Howard Marsh and McGee Marsh in Ottawa National Wildlife Refuge. Those areas there, they seem to prefer that. But when you see them, here's the bird on the left walking past me, and when it opens its wings, it becomes a completely different bird. You see this one, it doesn't really make a strong impression. It's kind of boring, and then it takes flight, and you get this beautiful wing pattern here. So it's a cool bird. They're very noisy when they're on breeding territory. It's kind of fun. I've seen them in salt marshes where they breed up along the East Coast, and they're pretty prolific. They're, you're in Florida, you're likely to see them. This one was taken in North Carolina, along the Outer Banks region, and there was several beaches that had this bird. And they're not terribly shy. You can get a good look at them, but as you can see, it's just nothing special to look at until it opens its wings. But it is the largest bird in the group. Probably, I think it's the largest bird that we're going to talk about today. So the bill comparison here, starting with the solitary, it's got a very thin bill, slight downward curve. Lesser yellow leg, straight bill, about the length of the head, maybe a little touch longer. Greater yellow leg's got that long bill that's noticeably longer than the width of the head. And the willet's got that thick base to the bill, longer than the greater yellow legs. Maybe about the same lengthwise proportionate to the head, but overall the bird is going to be larger and stockier and not as streamlined as either the yellow legs. So we're going to jump into the quiz photos now. Here's the fun part. And they're from all the groups that we've talked about today. It's not just Tringa, it's going to be Calidris as well. So anybody want to venture a guess or call out field marks on this one?
That'd be the lesser,
I'm sorry?
lesser yellow leg.
Lesser yellow leg?
Lesser yellow leg?
Does anybody agree with that?
Yeah.
Yes.
Agreed.
No.
I agree.
No.
Well, if you look at
Wait a minute.
if you look at this one,
It has a comma.
what do you see right
Doesn't it
there?
have a comma?
Oh, that's good.
I'm a,
You got an eye ring with
Know it.
a white
Spotted.
cilium,
so
got
it's
kind of that blunt
spotted.
spotted sandpiper.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
Shoulder has the white.
Yeah.
So I was hanging out at Lake St. Clair Metro Park, and this group of 5 birds dropped in front of me and started frantically foraging a few feet away. What do you think this one is?
Anderling.
Standerling? What makes you say Standerling?
Your description of them being together and running around in the sand.
Okay. First impression on this one, it's a mostly white bird with some black on it. And if you look here, there is no hind toe on this guy. So yes, indeed, it is the Standerling. All right, this one was in May in Taos. same kind of deal. I was laying in the sand, waiting for some shorebirds to get pushed by people that were just walking along the beach, and this one came up on me. What would you say this one is? It got kind of the straight bill. It's got a small head proportionate to the body, black legs, streaking on the head and the breast, and some nice, rich, mixed rusty tones with some dark brown. What would you say this one is? And keep in mind, this is in May. This is breeding plumage bird.
Oh, that's that one that was so beautiful that looks like the pebbles. Let me get my notes.
Is it a white
There-
rump?
Is it what? No.
No, wait. Wait.
No, it's fairly long. It's not real blunt. And maybe look at the feet here.
Sanderling.
It's also a sanderling. So if you look at that bird and that bird,
Oh, Sam.
that's a different bird.
Yeah.
But things that are going to be the same are leg color, no hind toe, bill length. The shape of it is the same, even though the plumage is completely different. So when I tell you that plumage is not your friend, this is what I mean. You might have seen this bird in August or September and think, okay, I got a good handle on sanderlings. And then you see one in migration in the spring and this one shows up and you can get lost. It's a tricky one. I know I struggle with this one a lot. It's just a completely different looking bird. All right, how about this one? You got small bird. It's got a curved bill with a fine tip. Got greenish yellow legs and short wings. Very small.
Is that the semi?
Close.
Okay.
Pay attention to that, how finely
Okay,
tipped
the-
the bill is.
Oh, the least.
Yes,
Least?
least. Least sandpiper.
Oh, least. Yeah.
So on this guy, the thing that you would want to pay attention to is how finely tipped that curved bill is. These yellow, greenish legs, warm colors, and that little bit of a cap right there.
Don't even know why.
All right, how about this one?
That's the semi.
So on this guy, you got to look black legs. So that rules out probably rules out least sandpiper. It doesn't look like there's any mud on them, right? But it has a lot of those same warm, buffy tones here. Well, what's noticeable about this? There's two things on this one I want you to think about. It's a thin, long bill.
Big head.
And long wings. Long wings on this one. And then you can get into, like, you look at that warm, buffy color back there. What do you think on this one?
A bear?
Nice.
That's correct. Baird
Baird.
sandpiper. All right. How about this?
Yay!
This is not a trick question. You got black belly patch, kind of that rusty chestnut color, long bill, round body shape, kind of big head.
Oh,
Dunlin.
Dunlin.
Dunlin, Gina had it too in chat. Very nice. Very good, guys. Yeah, this is a Dunlin in breeding plumage, Tawas Beach. Taken seconds away from that sanderling that we saw earlier in breeding plumage. They both were foraging together in small groups. All right, how about these two? It's not two species. I'll give you that clue. It's the same species, even though this one looks, for whatever reason, looks a lot bigger than this one.
The pectoral.
It is not a pectoral. Look at the legs here for your first clue. And the bill length.
Lesser?
You gotta check out that bill length.
So big.
Oh, like greater. Yellow later. Yeah, greater.
Yep, greater. Gina had it in chat too. Greater yellow legs. This one was different than the one we had in the slide because this one is in breeding plumage as well, so it's got a lot more streaking. It was a cold day, so look at that neck tucked in here. And the leg color is your first clue, but if you were to see this guy, you don't have that to go on. So you'd have to rely on the head shape and some of those more abstract field marks. All right, how about this guy? So pay attention to, got a relatively small proportion head to the body, got a short, thick base bill. It doesn't come to a fine point. It's got black legs. Carmela has it, semi-palmated. Very good. So this one's sort of, it's a default bird. You can see this bird and use it to compare to the other ones. So you see that bill, it doesn't really do much. It's a little short dagger. It doesn't curve, it doesn't have any upward curves to it either. It's very average in that way, and as is the shape. So the wings don't go past the tail here, about even with them. And it's not in very deep water. And if you were to see it, it would be about the size of a, yeah, they're all eating the same sort of things. Carmela, they generally are going to pick through for little bugs and worms and invertebrates that they find. You'll see that photo of, especially on the ocean beaches, of them pulling the giant sandworms out and those sort of things. So they're looking for protein in any way that they can choke down. Most of the birds that we see here, they're tactile. They use their bills to feel around in the mud, and the length of the bill tells you how deep they're going into the substrate to find that food. So the yellow legs are going to go a little deeper than these guys are going to be close to the surface. But they have small eyes compared to the birds that we're going to talk about next week, which are the plovers, which are visual hunters. They don't feel around and with their bills. They look with their eyes and they just grab it real quick, so they have shorter bills, and they're going to pick stuff right off the surface.
Huh.
All right, in flight. This is a different one I added from the last one, so this is fair game to anybody that was in that one as well. So here you're kind of losing some of the shape, but what are the field marks you might look for on this one? What are the shape differences that you might look for on this?
Long bill, chestnut back.
Yes, indeed, Jamie. That bill shape is the same whether
So
they're
it's
flying or what was that?
Wait, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. I can't see you, but I can hear you. So what anybody think? We got chestnut back. We got long bill, big head.
So
Anybody?
red. We got red
Red knot?
right?
Nope. A little bit smaller than a red knot. You see two of them, so you know it's a social bird. So what rule out solitary probably?
Dunlin.
Dunlin, yes. Very good.
Oh,
So,
okay.
yeah, you basically you can delete all of this stuff. Just look right here, and it'll tell you Dunlin. That's that distinctive bill, black, downward curving, drooping bill.
But you can't see the black belly.
No, and sometimes you'll see them, like this guy right here is in a transitional phase of his plumage. That might not be there, or there might be just faint little bits of black speckling there. I have a photo of a number of them flying with peckburl, but they don't have the black bellies yet. So they're early April. They haven't developed this really distinctive looking plumage yet. So you'll get something like this that's sort of in between, and you'll see hints of it, but they haven't gone into full breeding plumage yet. All right, how about this one?
Oh.
Okay.
Now,
Willet.
A willet.
Willet, yes, very good.
Will it?
It's big.
It's big. It doesn't look
yeah.
like anything. Got a thick bill base. It's got a long bill, and it doesn't look like anything else. Just that's a very thick
Frame.
Tringa bird, or Tringa genus bird, and yeah, it doesn't really jump out at you in any particular way. This is a non-breeding that was a little bit different in plumage than the bird that we saw in the previous slide. All right, here's the curveball that I have for you guys. This is a typical scene where you have a mixed flock on the beach foraging together. There are two species here, and this is one that gave me fits for a while because this bird in the center is the same as all these other smaller birds, even though that bill is different shape. And I'll tell you how I came to that conclusion after we get your guesses. So does anybody have a guess for these?
Red knots?
Yes, those are red knots. So by identifying these are fairly distinctive, but what else could it tell you? How to address these? These are also fairly large. This bird right here is the largest Calidris that we came up with. So comparing the sizes, it's not that much bigger than these. So that'll rule out your least sandpiper, your semi-palmated sandpiper, and probably your Bairds and white rumps. So what do you think these guys are based on that? I took some of them off the board for you.
Well, I already know, yeah. I look at the white patch there.
So if you look at this one, these are all kind of caught in between plumages. So they have a lot of white on them, but they also have a lot of streaking on them. They have that sort of average but a little bit longer bill than like a semi-palmated would have, but it's not crazy long like a Western. So these are sanderlings.
So sand.
Yep.
Sanderling.
Yes. So the reason why, if you look at this guy in the middle, he's got a long bill and it comes to a droop, which is something that I said was not part of the bill structure of the sanderling. So when I saw this bird, anybody want to guess what I thought or what I wanted this bird to be? I wanted it to be a Western sandpiper because I have no experience with Western sandpipers. I know what they look like, I know what to look for, but I've never crossed paths with them in a mixed flock. So I thought, this is in North Carolina. It's more in their range than it would be in the Great Lakes. But what ruled it out for me is, okay, these are all sanderlings. This bird looks to be the same size or even a little bigger than a sanderling. It can't be a Western sandpiper. They're smaller. So no matter what, even that bill is telling me Western, the size ruled out that species for me. So that's one of those things, like it can trip you up. So don't feel bad if you see a bird and you're like, I do not know what that bird is. Don't worry about that. Just enjoy them. This was a fun day. Just sitting in the sand on the beach. There's least tern colony behind me and American oyster catchers on my left side. And these guys just popped in. I wasn't expecting to see red knots and breeding plumage that day. It was in June, so they had, in theory, already moved past. But these two flew in with the sanderlings, and it was a great day. All right, here's a tricky one. Anybody know what that is? That is not one that we've covered. That's for next week.
Upland?
I'm sorry, what was that?
Is that an upland?
Close. It's one that it's a highly prized bird. It's the buff-breasted sandpiper. A lot of people are happy to see this little one. He is distinctive from the others in that, you know, the head shape and the coloration, some of the pattern on the back, they're unique to the species, and also it does not favor the same habitat. This is one that you'd have to many times go out to a sod farm to find or somewhere like that. And there's only a couple of them that ever passed through. This one I took on Labor Day last year. And yeah, he was pretty calm with all the people that were there partying. So some of the resources I put in here for you guys. The Shorebird Guide is a must-have if you want to really get into identifying them. it's a really comprehensive book that has a lot of comparison photos of different species. It's definitely not beginner level, so don't be discouraged if you pop it open and it's not immediately helpful to you. You probably want to use that one in combination with a good, your favorite field guide. So a couple of podcasts that I have linked here are the Shorebird ID tips from Alvaro Jaramillo. They're on the Birdwatchers Digest podcast channel. They cover all of that grouping strategy. I talked about putting different birds into different categories to help rule out others. And then All About Birds has a good built-in feature where you can compare side-by-side photos. So I recommend that if you want to, look up semi-palmated and then have that side-by-side comparison with a similar species that you might get it confused for. So I just want to thank everybody for coming out and checking out the presentation.